What I don't think you should do is have a financial system that is set up to extinguish risk.
And we're number one for international debt issuance. So yes, I guess we are going to attract some crime, and we do work to get that crime out.
What is your response to that? That yes, we want to keep people safe, but we also need to protect people's privacy online.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to POLITICO Europe's event, Sustainable Aviation Fuels and Technologies. Can Aviation Go Green? My name is Josh Pisana. I'm here in the middle of the Farnborough Airshow with my colleague Tommaso Leccia, who covers aviation. And we're here to discuss the issue of sustainable aviation fuels moving forward. First of all, a big thanks to RTX for hosting us in their pavilion here on the site. There might be some disturbances along the way because we're on an air show, so there's a lot of ambient noise. Occasionally, I think we'll experience that, especially over the next few minutes and over the coming hour. But before we really get underway and I introduce the Slido question we have, maybe I'll give Tommaso a chance to introduce himself.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, I'm Tommaso Lecca, mobility reporter at Politico, where I cover aviation. You are watching Politico Live, the live extension of Politico's unbiased journalism. Today, we are going to discuss the role of sustainable aviation fuels in the decarbonization of aviation. We are doing so from a special place. We are at the Farnborough International Airshow, an exhibition that brings together business leaders and innovators from the industries of aviation, aerospace, and defense. After recovering from the pandemic, the next challenge for the aviation sector is to ensure that its future growth is compatible with the emission reduction targets being pursued by many governments around the world. New technologies such as hybrid aircraft engines and powered by electricity or hydrogen could be the long-term solution, but the planes on which we are flying today are powered by kerosene and will be in service for decades to come. That's why SAF is a low-hanging fruit. Produced from a range of feedstocks, including used cooking oils, fats, waste, and crops, these sustainable fuels can reduce CO2 emissions by up to 80% compared to conventional jet fuel. But there are still many question marks about SAF, from the availability of biomass to the cost of sustainable fuel. Before we get started, we'll now hear some opening remarks from Graham Webb, Chief Sustainability Officer at Pratt & Whitney, and Phil Godfrey, Chief Sustainability Officer at Collins Aerospace. Over to you.
Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Graham Webb, the Chief Sustainability Officer for Pratt & Whitney, one of the world's largest engine manufacturers and of dependable aircraft engines for a broad range of markets. In this role, I lead the company's technology and product roadmaps with a strong focus on sustainability. An ambitious goal everyone working is here today is working in some way to achieve. As we learned today in today's discussion, improving aviation sustainability will take a broad range of measures, a variety of new technologies and alternative fuels, and potentially alternative energy carriers that collectively show the promise in reducing the industry's net CO2 emissions. There's also emerging factors to consider, including non-CO2 effects and contrails, which continue to challenge our collective understanding. So whether it's new approaches to thermal engines, hybrid electrification, SAF, or hydrogen, integration of these new technologies will require close coordination with regulatory agencies to ensure any new system meets the aviation's rigorous standards for safety. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for Politico for hosting today's panel discussion with such an esteemed group of panels and experts, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'll hand it over to Phil, my colleague.
Thanks, Graham. So my name is Phil Godfrey. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for Collins Aerospace. And Collins Aerospace also is committed to developing the technologies that aviation will need to become more sustainable. Technologies like hybrid electric propulsion, like systems to make the aircraft lighter, and like more intelligent routing. In my role of Chief Sustainability Officer, my what I have to do is to take the sustainable strategies that we've been developing and implement them. This is my key challenge. And as well as that, I'm responsible for embedding sustainability into all that we do. And a third point is that I'm very keen on engaging with stakeholders because I believe that when we collaborate together, we can go faster. And I think that's an excellent link to this panel, and I shall be listening out for opportunities for collaboration so that we can go faster. So a very warm welcome, and back to the moderators.
Okay, thank you guys, also for the kind words at the beginning. A few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Of course, Politico always likes to make its events as interactive as possible, so you can participate on Twitter, or X as it's now called, at Live Politico. There are also the hashtag Aviation Goes Green if you'd like to participate online too in the conversation. There's a Slido poll, as there always is. The question is, what is the main obstacle to scale up SAF production globally? There's 4 options that Tommaso has crafted for us there to pick from. Competition for feedstock, high cost compared to kerosene, low private investment, and number 4, weak government role. So I think that's pretty much it to get started. Now we can introduce the panel, right, for the coming conversation, Tommaso. So 4 speakers. First of all, Dr. Anna Aldani, Chief Scientist at the US Federal Aviation Administration, is joining us online. Hi, Anna, are you there? I think she's gonna, yeah, there she is, popping up magically. Hi.
Can you hear me?
Perfect. Then we have Anthony Henderson, Head of Low Carbon Fuel International and Trade at the UK Department for Transport. Hey, Anthony. Thanks for coming. Dorothy Reimeld, Vice President of Civil Aviation at the Aerospace Industries Association, is next up. Thank you. Welcome. And Steve Barrett is Regius Professor of Engineering at the University of Cambridge. Thank you too. I think we're very well represented here to have a conversation, a transatlantic conversation about this issue, and I'll hand over to Tommaso for the questions.
Thank you, Josh. Well, as Josh mentioned, we might have some interruption due to jet exhibition ongoing. So please remind, we are in Airshow, so we might have this problem, and that's why I will ask you to be as concise as possible, but please feel free to come in every question as you want to interact. So one of the main limitations of SAF today is its availability. There's simply not enough SAF to meet the demand, but even if there were more, today's aircraft cannot fly on a fuel blend containing more than 50% of SAF. So let's break the ice with a quick technology question for all of you. At which edition of the Farnborough International Airshow do you expect visitors and exhibitors to be able to fly to the UK in an aircraft powered by 100% of SAF? 2030, 32, 34, what do you think?
You started with the easy question, right? Well, clearly there's a mandate for carbon neutral growth by 2050. So mandates we have to take very seriously. But that said, maybe a little bit from a manufacturer's perspective that I represent is that the manufacturers are very committed to making progress in this area and to meeting the goal. And we're doing that through a number of ways. It's the new technologies, the new aircraft materials, new engines for our engine colleagues, and in a parallel effort with the exploration of how we advance SAF production more rapidly.
So what is the prediction, for the in terms of 100%?
Well, I'm going to say not later than 2050.
Yeah, I would say as well. It depends what the question is. We are there with the aircraft. The UK government, with the support of Virgin Atlantic and other partners, delivered the world's first 100% transatlantic flight last year. So we can do it. We can run planes on 100% SAF. The technology's there. We don't need to change anything. If the question is, when will we have enough SAF to be flying 100%, that's more difficult, I guess. But yeah, no later than 2050 is a good answer. I'm going to steal that one.
As soon as possible.
I'll maybe be a little bolder on this because so I think some of the nuance what Anthony was just referring to, that 100% SAF existing HEFA and a synthetic aromatic fuel that is currently trying to get approved under ASTM. And beyond that, we're also trying to get 100% SAF standard approved under ASTM. And I think they've both been working at that for a few years. So I'll be bolder and say 2027 we'll have it, be able to actually file 100% SAF with an aromatic synthetic fuel. So just to be a little blunt, I think we can do it pretty quickly. It's whether it's going to be there, that's a whole other question. But technically, I think we can get it done in ASTM.
Unfortunately, in 2027 there is no Farnborough Airshow, but maybe 2028. Fingers crossed, maybe. Over to you.
No, I would just agree with that. I think we can move much faster, especially since we'll have, let's say 10% in the 2030s, and that's enough to fly some flights with 100% SAF. And I think we should do that to build confidence in the industry.
Well, what I wanted to demonstrate with this question is that, in fact, there is so much complex issue that even a very simple technology question about the prediction hides a wide range of variables. And from the availability of the raw materials to government support and technological process, let's tackle each one of these. Stephen, I will start with you again. What is the problem with SAF when it comes to biomass availability? Are current feedstock requirements limiting SAF production?
Yeah, I mean, biomass availability is a key thing. So essentially, we want to decarbonize aviation. So you could do that by taking biomass-derived sustainable aviation fuel. So you grow a plant or a crop that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, that creates the crop. You then convert that to the fuel, burn it, it re-releases the carbon. That's sort of probably the most cost-effective thing to do. The problem is that there's only so much land, and you don't want to affect food or other uses, and you don't want to compromise other uses of bioenergy. So there's obviously a limit on that. Now you can also use wastes like agricultural wastes or municipal solid waste, rubbish basically. That's limited too. So there are various limited pools that we can sustainably use. Now there's many different projections. People can have lengthy debates over quite how much there is. But what probably is certain is that provided we all want a growing and sustainable aviation industry, at some point there won't be enough biomass, which means at some point you have to go to eSAF, the sustainable fuel created from green electricity, taking carbon directly from the atmosphere rather than using plants. So in the long term, that's probably inevitable.
And I would also like to hear from Dorothy what the civil aviation industry is asking from regulators in Europe and the US to accelerate the adoption of SAF around the world. Is there anything that one country is doing that you would like to see replicated elsewhere?
Well, I think, to the first part of your question, clearly, as I mentioned earlier, the industry is very focused on the efficiencies of aircraft and of the components of the aircraft. And those efficiencies are only created in partnership with governments. So by extension, I would suggest that the SAF production element is going to require the partnership between industry and government, and not just the aviation regulators. We're also talking about other parts of governments, the regulation of the agricultural businesses and electrics. So I think the short answer, and here's the background noise we were talking about, is it's the partnership between the regulations being developed and the industry.
Is this partnership there, Anna? What do you think?
Yeah, actually, I think it's there. At least, we see it in the US, the SAF Grand Challenge that was announced in 2021. That gave us the opportunity for, maybe not the first time we'd been working with the other agencies, but it was the first time where there was a concerted effort across the departments of transportation with the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, Department of Energy, and the Department of Agriculture, USDA, with additional support from the Environmental Protection Agency to really have this focused goal on both a near-term and long-term goal for domestic SAF production. So as Dorothy was saying, it requires multiple agencies, not just the aviation regulators, because we're now talking about an industry that spans many different sectors, and it requires everyone sort of putting their focus and understanding where the challenges are and how to address the barriers. And that's what we've been doing with the SAF Grand Challenge. It's really allowed us to have those new relationships across the agencies to work collaboratively, which I think has been really helpful.
Thank you so much, Anna and Dorothy, for your replies, despite we are experiences what it means to be at the Airshow of Farnborough. This is actually a very adapt stage, let's say, for discussing these topics, including aircraft noise, indeed. So we were saying, I want to move to Anthony. I think another issue that we have now is that not every region in the world will have the same capacity to produce SAF because of the problems we were mentioning before in terms of availability of biomass. So right now the US is doing better than Europe on the production side, but at some point the old continent may develop a new energy dependency from abroad. Is this a prospect that worries you at some point?
No, not at all. I think look, the UK would like to be a leader in sustainable aviation fuel development. That is an aspiration for the government set out this week with the announcement of the SAF mandate and the commitment to bring in legislation for a revenue certainty mechanism. You know, we're putting the framework in place to bring production to the UK. But there are a lot of planes in the world and we need a lot of production, and it's very unlikely that the UK will be able to produce all of the SAF that it needs. So we want to see global development of SAF production in all parts of the world that we can import from and use, so long as that the fuels that are produced globally are truly sustainable and are using the right feedstocks. So that's our aim, that's our focus. So yeah, it's a mix of both. We want to do it ourselves, but we need the imports to get there as well.
Yeah, and what are the most promising types of SAF that you've seen so far, and what can governments do to scale them up?
So I think in the UK, we're very much focused. I don't really like these terms, but I'm going to use them anyway. The second and third gen technologies, so those wastes to residues and recycled carbon fuels in the second gen and the power to liquid e-fuels in the future. That's very much where we're focused. Given the reasons you brought up with issues around biodiversity loss, deforestation, land use change that can come from crops, and actually on the used cooking oil side, you know, there's a greater and greater risk of fraud in the system as there's greater and greater demand. Actually, is that truly a used cooking oil? Has someone dipped a bit of chicken in and said that's used? Yeah, so you know there's risk there. So I think how
do you control that? How can you be sure that it's used cooking oil?
Robust trade schemes, I guess, but that's not really my area, so I'm not sure. But that's why we're focused on that second and third gen, and that's what we would like to see develop globally. It's truly more sustainable, delivers greater greenhouse gas savings, and that's what we're doing this for, right? We're doing this to tackle climate change, so that's what we should be focused on.
Thank you. And I also wanted to talk a bit about another issue that is the money problem. Because not only SAF is up to 4 times more expensive than fossil jet fuel, depending on the type of SAF can be even more than 4 times, but it also requires a lot of investment to be produced. So, Stephen, how are the companies dealing with this issue? How do you see this evolving?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a key point because you know, there's sort of 2 kinds of problems. There's challenges and there's facts, right? Challenges you can kind of solve, and facts you have to live with. And it probably is a fact that that SAF is going to be more expensive than Jet A, than fossil fuel. There's sort of fundamental limits for that. You know, if you use biomass, there's a limited supply. It costs a certain amount to produce it. There's not much capacity to reduce the cost beyond a certain point. So it will get cheaper, but very unlikely to be cheaper or cost competitive with jet fuel. So, for example, most of the final fuel bill for a SAF is the feedstock, and we've been producing feedstock for millennia, right? So that's only going to get so much cheaper. So that means we're in a world where we have to live with, as a society, more expensive fuel. Now, that's not the end of days for aviation. Aviation has very robust demand to fluctuations in fuel price, and potentially the SAF fuel will not be hugely more expensive. But it does mean there needs to be mechanisms that might vary by region and country that mean that there can be a level playing field where industry can, with certainty, invest in producing fuels, and airlines and suppliers know they can buy those fuels and will be able to sell them. So you need pretty robust mechanisms. Now, the civil servants perhaps can't speak as freely on this as I can, but you know, if you're to simplify it, America's gone for all carrots and Europe's gone for mostly sticks, and the UK is sort of trying a bit of both there with the revenue certainty mechanism. And now the carrots are very good to help initial investment, and you've seen a lot in the US recently. The challenge with what's in the US right now is that it's challenging in terms of its political and economic sustainability. So it's very expensive, and will it survive over multiple administrations, right? So it's sort of not got that long-term certainty. And if you want investors to put billions and billions of dollars into plants, they need to know there's a market there for 30 years for it to be a rational decision. Something like what the UK is working on, this revenue certainty mechanism, could be a way of doing that, where you have a stick which is, rather than short-term free money, it's long-term de-risking. So I think long-term de-risking is really the key component that we need to start seeing in these different schemes around the world to help investors make rational decisions.
If I could, Tommaso, I think to add on to what you said, a key point to reiterate is that fuel prices have always fluctuated, whether for aircraft or look at what we're paying right now for automobiles. But I think something that makes it difficult for me to really understand where the price point would be is, where is that culmination of the newer technologies, the continued efficiencies that are being developed in the air traffic systems, and the development, the ability to produce the fuel at scale? You know, I do believe it's going to become much more cost effective. But I can't say with any certainty. So maybe I'm not quite as convinced that we'll never get to a better parity. But, you know.
Well, I think you raised a good point, though, which is that aircraft technology does improve, and we will see, you know, a halving in the engine intensity of an aircraft by 2050 is not crazy, right?
Right.
It could offset much of or most of the fuel price. So the ticket price might not change as much as the fuel price might suggest. And of course, only about a third of the ticket price really is the fuel. So, I mean, it's not like a doubling in fuel cost would double your ticket anyway. It would be a much more damped effect. So I think the industry will continue to thrive, but I agree there are ways to damp that effect or maybe even wipe it out.
And if I could maybe just really quickly add on that, maybe some of the aircraft noise on the points of cost parity. On the points of cost parity with conventional today, I think while it will always be very expensive to make SAF, like Stephen said, we take advantage of a very passive natural process when we're using conventional kerosene, and we have to replicate that for synthetic fuel. I think if we're able to properly value the environmental benefits, the environmental services of SAF, which is what people are paying for, and really understand that if we're making the decision to decarbonize economy-wide, if we see that insurance companies and financial institutions are making decisions based on the costs of a changing climate, predicted costs, you know, we even are doing these analyses for airports that we expect may be flooded or subject to severe weather events, things like that. Those are all costs that society is paying that is not actually currently being captured by the sort of cheapness or the current price of the conventional Jet A. So I think, yes, it'll always be more expensive, but there might be a way to actually more fairly compare the two products rather than the way it's being currently compared, which I really think is doing a disservice to what SAF is aiming to achieve. So just a little bit extra on the price point.
You want to, yeah.
No, so, so just building on what Anna said, the Department for Transport runs a social survey every year, and evidence from that shows that consumers are willing to pay more for their flights if it shows that it's decarbonised. People genuinely care about this. They want, when they fly, they want to know they're doing it in the right way. So our evidence is showing that that's the case. And this is completely anecdotal, but we've been working with stakeholders a lot on things like book and claim models and the corporate demand for SAF. And actually it's very high because the other option is offsetting, and they don't trust the offsets. They don't trust the offsetting schemes, and they want to show to their shareholders and also their wider consumers that they are actually offsetting their Scope 3 emissions within the value chain. So actually, yes, it is more expensive, but I'm not sure it stops the demand for it at the moment. And then, of course, the faster and greater we scale the SAF production, hopefully we'd reach parity a bit quicker.
Thanks, Celeste. I just have a question for all of you on a more thematic question around where these fuels go, because this event is about using them in aviation, but there's also a similar debate in shipping, in the road transport arena too. Also, I guess, to a certain extent, military, which overlaps with air transport as well. I just wondered if you think enough work is being done at a governmental level to prioritize the order in which certain sectors get these fuels as they come on the market and as production capacity ramps up. Anybody want to take that first? Anthony, maybe, government.
I can take it to an extent. So there is actually lots of work across government happening on this, at least in the UK at the moment. So last year, the Department for what was Business and Energy, now DESNZ, Energy Security, Net Zero, produced a biomass strategy, which didn't quite prioritise across the economy, but indicated that prioritisation would need to happen. So we're working across government to understand the implications of that and make sure that our policy development is aligned across government, and that when we introduce our SAF mandate, we're not inadvertently increasing emissions in another sector who may need those resources even more. And then I sit in the low carbon fuels team. We've also been considering that just within transport. So how do we, fairly distribute resources across maritime, aviation, road? Obviously, road, our view is it should electrify. It shouldn't require any of the biomass, but going forward. So I would say that is actively happening for us at the moment.
One thing I'd add, actually building on Anna's previous point of valuing the environmental benefits of SAF, you could also value the energy independence and security benefits of SAF, and we certainly see in the world with geopolitical events today how much that really matters, right? And developing a robust SAF industry will really help with energy security and independence, which are slightly different things, but would certainly help with both, either by diversifying feedstock supplies, particularly for the UK, a smaller country, or in the US, it probably would lead to more energy independence.
Yeah, and thanks, Stephen, for saying that, because that often gets sort of said, but it, I think, is only of increasing importance as we see globally. But on the where the fuels are going to be used across which sectors, I think it goes beyond fuels, and it's actually just energy and where energy goes across the sector. And I think a good example of this is, we know that eventually PTL, power to liquid, e-fuels will likely come into play. But as we currently are with the US grid, using renewable electricity, which if you're going to make PTL fuels, because it's so energy intensive, you really can't do it any other way. You don't want to use any conventional power production to make these types of fuels. Displacing the renewable electricity to make a low carbon liquid fuel versus actually just using that renewable electricity to decarbonize the grid, you're going to have a severe penalty. So you're going to have 3 times the carbon reduction benefit if you actually just decarbonize the grid and use it as electricity rather than diverting it to create a liquid fuel that then gets burned. As we all know, there's a lot of losses in combustion versus using it as electricity. So I think that's also part of the conversation of not only where do we use the biofuels and the liquid, sustainable fuels, but also where do we use the renewable electricity and how do we prioritize that? And that's going to be different, country by country, region by region. There's certain countries that have a lot of renewable electricity. They have a very clean grid, and they can maybe progress in a different manner than other countries. So I think that's an important thing to consider when you're talking. It's never, one size fits all. There's many different sizes as we look across the globe.
And if I could add on to Anna, what you said, I think it's spot on. So it's not just prioritization among the different industries, if you will. I mean, it's almost like picking winners and losers when you have that kind of a conversation, because these are directly tied to countries' economic standing. So in a lot of ways, I think the conversation needs to be more, if we're talking about priorities, that it's shaped in a manner that is not disadvantaging one industry over the other, because they're all important, right? And then the other piece of it that always goes through my mind is how industries can share lessons learned. Because again, as an industry moves forward to its own green future, whatever the industry, I'm agnostic, some move more quickly because they don't have the clearances, but perhaps other ones do. And how do we create the forum, the ability to talk about sharing best practices, whether it's clearing regulatory hurdles or clearing technological hurdles, And those conversations, they're not natural. We talk within our industries. We know our stakeholders. It's less natural to talk outside of the industry. And again, as we talked about earlier, this is regulatory discussion and decisions across multiple parts of the multiple industries. So I don't have the solution as I'm thinking about this, but I think it's a missing discussion.
Is the car sector one of the industries you are thinking about?
Absolutely.
And as the car sector, do you see space for new technologies also in the aviation sector, such as electric-powered aircraft, hydrogen aircraft, not only the sustainable aviation fuels?
Sure, absolutely, and clearly you can walk out in this show and see the examples of the thinking of the electrical. I saw several hydrogen powered engines on display. So all of that technology is evolving. But I think what I'm trying to suggest, Tommaso, is some technologies move more quickly than others do. And in aviation, our technology, the ideas are fast and furious, but our ability to ensure that we're introducing products and services in a safe manner and rapid enough to meet the demands of the industry, sometimes that's a lengthier process. And that's kind of part of my thinking when I say about, using lessons learned from other industries. How can we be more efficient in introducing the new technologies?
But just to build on that, I mean, aviation is sort of uniquely difficult. First, you need a tightly specified safety critical fuel that never fails you. That has to be extremely energy dense, so batteries are not going to cut it for long-haul flights ever, according to physics as we understand it. Maybe several Nobel Prizes might fix that, but based on current understanding, that's not going to happen. So that means you need a liquid fuel, and that really leaves you essentially with two options, either something that looks like jet fuel or something like liquefied hydrogen, which is a whole different way of doing it. In terms of the sort of system inertia, that's a really key point. So let's say we came up with a new aircraft. Pratt & Whitney and others came up with the engine that reduces energy use by 90%. It might take 10 years to start entering the fleet. Then for it to propagate through the fleet will take 30 years because of the market dynamics of the industry, and it's really hard to do it faster than that. So that takes us way past 2050. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, and that is critical to sustainability, even in time for 2050, because it will decrease the amount of energy we need. But you can't efficiency your way to net zero. So SAF is really critical on this path to get us to net zero in time for 2050. And without SAF, there's no way to do it, essentially.
Stephen, I wanted to ask you something about sustainability, because when we talk about climate, we always focus on CO2, but it's not only CO2. There's also the non-CO2 effects, which according to some studies is responsible for the most of the contribution of aviation to climate change. Mm-hmm. Do you think SAF will bring some benefits also on this side?
It's sort of unclear. So broadly speaking, aviation has two big climate challenges. One is CO2. And one is aviation-induced cloudiness or contrails. These are the white line-shaped thin clouds you see behind airplanes sometimes. Now, those are estimated, as you say, to cause roughly as much warming as all of the CO2 from aviation. So they're a uniquely hard challenge for our sector, essentially. So we basically have to solve both of them. Now, there is the potential that using SAF might mitigate the effect of contrails by some amount, but the studies are sort of unclear. And at most, it's something like, maybe it's 25%. One study said 50%, another study said 0%. So it's in that range of sort of 0 to 50%. So it's never going to be enough to solve that issue. You'll always have to do something called contrail avoidance to ultimately avoid creating contrails. So the main reason for SAF really is CO2, and there might be these co-benefits that relate to contrails. Another co-benefit, another small one, is the fuel burns a bit cleaner and reduces soot emissions, so better air quality. Again, a smaller co-benefit, but still nice to have less pollution around airports. So these are good to have, but primarily SAF is about CO2.
Are European and US governments doing enough to face the non-CO2 effects of aviation in Europe?
Well, you're asking a researcher who thinks everything should be done now, so in that sense, no. But in reality, I mean, the US is investing in this area. I'm on a National Academies Committee for the US that's looking into a strategy for the US on that. In Europe, obviously, is implementing an MRV for contrails, which there's lots of debate around that. And the UK has, at least until the election, the Jet Zero Council, of which has an action group creating a national trial, which I was actually chairing. And the new government may or may not continue that, but hopefully they will, at least in some form, continue that work and take that forward. So I think there is movement, and it can always go faster, but there is movement.
Back to the SAF topic. Anna, so far has been recalled even before, the US have taken the carrot approach, let's say, massively subsidizing the green sector, including SAF, through the Inflation Reduction Act. This has been very helpful in attracting investments and making SAF production a business case. But how do you ensure that the sustainability standards are good enough to guarantee that SAF will fulfill its core mission, which is reducing CO2 emissions?
My name is, I am Italian, so when you said Anna, I was like, oh, he's really saying my name. Okay, so on how we're making sure that we ensure the sustainability of these fuels. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, it provides, there's really 3 provisions in there that are helping address SAF availability. So we first have the 40B tax credit, known as the SAF Blenders Tax Credit. Then that's going to be followed by 45Z tax credit, which is the clean fuel production credit that expands beyond SAF, and it covers all transportation fuels. And then finally, there's the FAST program, what we're calling the FAST program, Fueling Aviation Sustainable Transition. It's section 40007. And that's really addressed at investing, providing funding for infrastructure that either produces, transports, stores, or blends SAF. And all of those require a minimum, I would say, about 50%. 40B and the FAST program have 50%. 45Z has a slightly differently defined reduction, but we can say for ease of conversation, it's a 50% reduction. And that helps address some of the uncertainty that is around what is the true life cycle value of these fuels. And when I'm saying life cycle value, I mean the carbon intensity, the life cycle greenhouse gases that are emitted as part of producing these fuels compared to our conventional jet fuel baseline. And so we're asking for at least a 50% reduction so that we can reach those decarbonization goals. We know we need to go far beyond 50% if we want to get to fully net zero, but it's a way of incentivizing that those reductions are happening. And both the 40B and 45Z tax credits are actually performance-based. So for every additional percentage reduction, you get a higher tax credit benefit. In terms of how do you ensure that the sustainability requirements are being met, both of them reference the CORSIA program, so the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It's part of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. I always try to spell out most of the acronyms I work with in case people aren't familiar with them. And in there, the methodologies and sustainability criteria are quite robust, and they cover a variety of requirements from water and land use to even labor and how employees and all of the different sort of social aspects of how these fuels are being produced.
Yeah.
And so as much as we can on domestic side, we try to align with those and ensure that the models we're using actually represent the reductions that are happening as these fuels are being produced.
Yeah,
Apologies if that was lengthy.
Yes, and just still on this subject, there are some regulatory differences between the EU and the US. We know that some feedstock that are allowed in the US are not allowed in the EU. Do you think at some point there will be a necessity for harmonization in the feedstock topic?
I think as much as people want to harmonize it, I mean, having harmony is a very appealing idea, but I think we have to recognize that there's going to be differences in both sort of political, cultural climates, but also resource availability. What works in one region of the world is not necessarily going to work in another, and we shouldn't make that assumption that it's going to be the same. The US, for better or worse, has a lot of waste. We also have a lot of biomass availability. I know Stephen was mentioning some of the restrictions there, and there are definitely limitations to how much biomass feedstock is available. The DOE actually did a recent update to their billion-ton study. So again, depending on the assumptions you make on whether technology is going to be able to use agricultural residues and all of these other types of waste, you can argue, yes, we'll have enough, and we won't impact the food projected and for food and feed that we'll need with a growing population. But I think where we can harmonize and align, that is great, but we should never seek that as the ultimate, that we've failed if these things are not perfectly aligned, because we're working, globally with regions of the world that have very different resource availability that we just have to acknowledge and accept and try and find compromise as best we can.
And Anthony, what do you think about spaces for harmonization now that in the UK there is a new government? Do you see more possibility to harmonize legislation with the EU and the US? And also, how about developing nations? Do you see also room for more projects in these countries to help in terms of SAF supply?
Yeah, so I'm going to build on what Anna said. So each state can decide to use its resources how it wishes to do so. In the UK, so the government re-announced the SAF mandate on Monday this week. And for us, our feedstocks are waste and residue-derived biofuels, recycled carbon fuels, and the e-fuels, the power to liquid, no crops.
At least on mandates, there is harmony between Tories and Labour. So, okay.
I'm not going to comment on that. But no crops. There is partly the reason that I mentioned earlier about the risks of deforestation, but we understand that other states do have a lot of biomass available to them that they can use for their own fuel production. The UK doesn't have that. We don't have enough land to be producing a lot of biofuels, which is why we're focused on the waste and residues, and particularly that second gen on recycled carbon fuels, which we recently passed legislation on. So I don't think harmonisation is always required. It has to be specific to the state that's producing it and its own circumstances. And if we want to build an industry in the UK, it's important to take that into account, because other fuel types may be a lot cheaper but not necessarily deliver the best GHG savings. So it's important to keep sustainability at the heart of that.
What about the role of developing countries?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier, but like I said, we want to see a thriving global market. I think I've said a few times, but we kind of see it as like a democratization of fuel production. No longer will we have to rely on states who just happen to have oil and gas in their ground. Like, all states can produce this now. In last financial year, the UK government funded 3 projects in developing states in Africa to do feasibility studies of SAF production. So we're actively supporting, and that's through ICAO, through their ACT SAF program. We're actively supporting developing states to develop these technologies.
Could I give an example of where it might be good to harmonise? So,
please.
The EU and the UK mechanisms have what's called a buyout. So that's essentially, if you can't get enough SAF, then you pay a kind of premium cost for the remaining the SAF you're missing. Now, the EU and the UK schemes are different, so that probably means at some point the SAF will flow one way or the other to minimise the cost of the industry. So there are some areas where we need to think through carefully how the different systems will interact, and if that produces any perverse outcomes, or if those are outcomes that we're happy to live with and just peculiarities of the system. So that's a particular example of where some heads need to get together and think through what the outcomes are going to be from that game, as it were, when that's played out.
But is there enough coordination globally on this? Are there already systems set up that these kind of conversations about the buyout scheme can happen?
We talk to the EU in developing our policy, but we take different approaches. We have considered the EU policy in designing our policy, and we don't foresee any particular issues. But we would always monitor these things as we go forward. But
there is no constant exchange or platform through which you can have these conversations about aligning.
I mean, there's a lot of groups that states go to. We have ECAC, so the European. Oh God, I can't remember what it stands for. But ECAC, let's go with that. I'm not as good at. I'm not as good. Yeah, I'm not as.
Yeah. I can translate.
Yeah. I'm not as good at Anna at spelling out my abbreviations. Sorry, you've shown me up, Anna.
If I maybe I
Yes.
heard the question. Maybe I translated it a little bit differently. So the cooperation between the U.S. and Europe is very broad on so many issues. I think what we're really talking, or what I heard, was political will, and there's certainly the political will in when we talk about the U.S. and the EU in terms of SAF. Your question was about developing countries. I think that's a very different conversation, because we cannot sit here and say with certainty that the political will exists broadly. And Anna can attest to this from the many, many years of discussions at ICAO on this. You know, countries, and no country in particular, see this issue, the issue of going green, very, very differently. And that's going to be the challenge for us collectively. We could do everything right on time and you know, meet the 2050 goal, and then still have areas of the world where.
Well, we're seeing positive signs. Of course.
We are, and I'm not trying to suggest that we're not, but it is such a huge effort when you look at it through that lens. It's not a technical issue at all. It's not a production issue at all. It is very much of a political will.
And Dorothy, since you mentioned political will, let me ask you, are you concerned that this government support that we have seen so far in the SAF industry may fade away in the coming years? Let me rephrase this. If Donald Trump wins the election, and are you confident that he will continue to subsidize green technologies?
Oh, boy. I think what I would say is that, you know, frankly, irrespective of what happens in November in the U.S., the industry remains committed to the work that it is doing to, you know, to meet the 2050 goal. I think that, you know, we'll certainly know more once November rolls around. So I think that's really the most I would want to say about that.
But I think one of the challenges is the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act policy is essentially free money for a period, which is very useful. But free money is not a very politically sustainable policy because, you know, hard times happen, governments change. You can't really sustain free money over a long period of time. That's why probably ultimately you need both the carrots and the sticks, because the mandates are relatively cheap for the government to implement. They don't hit the public finances in the same way. It still obviously costs real money, but it's more politically sustainable as a mechanism. So I think in the long run, I hope the US does move towards some kind of mandate or other mechanism that is more sustainable in the long term. But I'll not hold my breath.
Well, of course, now the focus is on the US because of the upcoming elections, but also the EU, which just went through the European Union, the European Parliament elections, had like an important political change, and now there are some of the targets, the objectives of the Green Deal, which are in discussion again. And particularly in the car industry, there is a discussion about the possibility that Europe could go back to that 2035, for instance, ban on selling new cars with internal combustion engines. This is exactly what's about one of the questions that I'm seeing from the public. This comes from Jordan Dahl, which is our colleague covering, of course, the car sector in Brussels. And she's asking what is the likelihood that the Green Deal will be revised in this term, and what will be the consequences for aviation? What do you think? Anybody can take it.
Speaking specifically on the Green Deal.
No insight, really.
No insight on this?
So speaking to representative.
Can you guys
Sorry
hear?
that I interrupted Anna. I'll let Anna go first.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I wasn't sure if you could hear me. I think this gets to a broader question, actually the first poll question about what's the greatest challenge for SAF reduction. I think it's just this consistency in government policies, in what we do as an industry and what we do as a society. So these changes that we see, I think it's partly due because if you're taking too strong of a position on one side or the other and not trying to find a compromised path that in the end is going to be more sustainable, not from necessarily a purely environmental or climate perspective, but the true meaning of the word sustainable, and that it can endure for a long time. So we need to find policies, we need to find programs, we need to find efforts that have benefits, not just for one side, but that do have benefits that really meet the needs of a broad public and have that broad public support. And that's why you see in the US, we have the opportunity and the ability to use feedstocks, right? And because we recognize the importance of making sure that U.S. agriculture is part of the solution and that they find ways to decarbonize their production, and that's going to make, in the end, whatever we're doing, have a greater likelihood of being able to survive any sort of administration changes one way or the other, because there's going to be benefits on both sides. And so I think that's really important, whether it's Europe, the U.S., Asia, Middle East, Africa, you need to understand what does the population need across the scale. And I understand, mandates do have a certain appeal. I think what we can see, depending again on the specific area that you're operating under, they might not be that mandatory. If in the end there's going to be lawsuits or cases filed, or they just pay a penalty, are you actually decarbonizing aviation? So I think at a certain point when the industry is getting closer to maturity, mandates make sense. But in some of the earlier times, you need to create the environment where doing what we're saying is the right thing is the easy choice from an industry perspective.
And since we are here at the air show, I also want to focus on the other technologies that we are seeing here around. And I want to ask you, is there anything you have seen that's kind of grab your attention, that you think this could be the next breakthrough in the aviation sector in terms of technology? Talking about electric, talking about hydrogen, talking about hybrid, also a mix of different engines. Is this something that you are looking at particularly?
Well, I think there's a lot of exciting technologies that are on show. I mean, it's a pretty amazing industry when you think about it. You can get on a plane and show up halfway around the world with more safety than any other mode of transport. Right? It's sort of ridiculously capable, and it's still advancing incredibly. I think in terms of things that will really move the needle. I mean, every generation of aircraft and engines tends to improve fuel efficiency by 15% or so. That doesn't sound like it will transform overnight, but another 2 generations, that really is a big contribution towards reducing the fuel burn. So even though the fuel or the price per unit fuel will, let's say, double, if you're decreasing the fuel burn by something approaching half, then you really are making things more affordable in the long term as societies get richer. So it does look pretty positive. In terms of a sort of transformative technology, a magic bullet electric aircraft, that doesn't really exist, right? The physics just doesn't really allow it. So it's really a long slog of breakthrough technologies, but there's no, Star Trek technology that we wave a wand and suddenly we have
a long slog, baby steps toward a different operation. Maybe adding on to what you said, for anyone that's watched some of the flying displays and some of the aircraft that are up there, I can have a regular conversation sitting out on the deck, and that to me is phenomenal. It represents obviously such a quantum leap in the engine technology and the reduction of noise. So yeah, just maybe to complement what you said, I mean, I've walked a lot of the halls, and it's fun to see products that we read about, we hear about, we debate in forum and stuff, and see that it's a real thing. Now, back to your point, the real thing still has steps to go, whether it's through the certification process or even the design and production and installation. But it is encouraging to see just the breadth of new technology that is out there.
I think one thing we need to keep an eye on long term related to SAF is hydrogen, because that's really the other option, right? And the basic reason why you'd consider hydrogen is that we discussed earlier how biomass derived SAF at some point will run out. There's just not enough land, and we want aviation to grow. We want a more connected world, not less, for obvious reasons when we look around the world today. So we'll eventually run out of biomass-derived SAF, so then we need to go to eSAF. Now, making an electrofuel, which is a complex, long-chain hydrocarbon, is pretty energy-intensive. So to give you the same energy on board an aircraft, you'd spend about a third less energy if you just made hydrogen, which is a really simple molecule you can much more easily make. So in the long run, it might end up being cheaper to make hydrogen for aviation than eSAF. But I think that's a much longer term thing, and there's many challenges to overcome in hydrogen, and we'd want it to be as safe as conventional fuel. And there's many hard learned lessons in aviation safety that might have to be relearned with hydrogen, that we don't want to take any chances there. But in the long term, there might well be a case for hydrogen that starts to make sense just from the economics.
I give a much more boring answer than what has been given so far. I actually think
not too boring, please.
Not too boring, but I think airspace modernisation is actually really interesting, and there was a few stands here talking about that. I mean, obviously it's not a radical new technology, but it's something we haven't done since like 1950. We're still using the same airspace-like rules. That's crazy. And if we look at the Virgin flight that we did last year, so obviously it was a test flight, but it was prioritized on its taxiing, its ascent to descent, and the level it flew at, much more direct route. It wasn't a crazy contribution to the carbon savings it generated. Most of it was from the south, but it wasn't nothing. And if you put that across every flight that's taking off from the UK, that's a huge amount of carbon that we could be saving. So yeah, maybe it's a future tech, but maybe it shouldn't be. It's maybe something we should be doing now. If only there was a department dedicated to transport, but yeah.
And well, on that note,
yeah.
we can tell. We discussed about many aspects of this issue. We discussed about the technology. We discussed about the availability. We discussed about the regulatory problems or regulatory perspective that we might have in the next few years. And
yeah. Over to me to close it out. We pride ourselves on punctuality here at Politico, so we're closing and we've got 3.5 minutes left. That's just enough time, I think, to thank our panelists. Also, and give you the results of the survey, the Slido survey, which we explained at the beginning, will be available to you all. The question was, what is the main obstacle to scale up SAF production globally? This was a topic we returned to during the debate. And of course, by far, the biggest response was for the high cost compared to kerosene. It was 47% of those that responded. So quite telling results to that survey. Yeah, any comments any of you want to make about it? I guess it always comes down to cost, right?
I'm hoping weak government didn't go because of me.
I know, I was like, well, at least it's not weak government.
So yeah, on that note, thank you very much, guys. Again, like to thank RTX for hosting us in their pavilion today and being the partner for this event. And any feedback can go to live@politico.eu. Thank you. Have a good day.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
What I don't think you should do is have a financial system that is set up to extinguish risk.
And we're number one for international debt issuance. So yes, I guess we are going to attract some crime, and we do work to get that crime out.
What is your response to that? That yes, we want to keep people safe, but we also need to protect people's privacy online.